Okay, we had left off here. We hadn't gotten to this slide yet, but we now look at the importance of the railroad industry in the Gilded Age. It's fair to say that at least in the beginning, first half, say, of this era, the railroad was the most important industry in the country. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which we took a look at in the last unit, isn't surprising, meaning it's not surprising that the first national strike in U.S. history happened as a railroad strike because these were the big, powerful, wealthiest corporations of their time, most influential ones. So the railroad industry was center in the Gilded Age, industrialization, in the center of industrial capitalism. It might be fair to say, that by the latter part of the Gilded Age, the central industry was banking and finance. We'll get to that as well, but it's a judgment call on both of them. So the railroads set kind of a precedent for how big businesses would operate, not just throughout the rest of the Gilded Age, but even beyond. They promoted economic growth and stimulated other industries. So how did they promote economic growth? Well, if you see the little map there on the left, little feelers of railroad routes, and we already know that this is just part of the country, and that there's already a transcontinental railroad from 1869, three more transcontinental lines by the 1880s, and this just revolutionized transportation in the country. Personal transportation too, but mainly, for business purposes, transporting goods, commodities. So, but again, how did this promote economic growth? Because it opened up more markets. It opened up national markets. The Transcontinental Railroad really marks the moment at which it becomes realistic for business people, owners of factories in certain industries, say the steel industry, Carnegie Steel Company, to think about selling, marketing nationally. It just wasn't feasible before this. Why? Well, let's say before railroads went in, how did you get goods from New York, let's say, to Michigan? See Michigan because it kind of sticks out with the Great Lakes around it in the Midwest. Well, you had to get them there by canal and roads and dirt roads and through mountains and forests, and it was a cumbersome process. It took a long time and it was expensive. So the point is that if you were a steel producer in Pennsylvania, New York, and you made a lot of money. You had say 3 factories, 3 steel mills, and you saturated the East Coast with your steel, meaning there wasn't any more market for it. You made just enough steel, more or less, per year, but you couldn't really sell more because everybody that needed steel sort of bought from you and your competitors. So you might have wanted to make more profits. I want to build 3 new factories and have 6 and double my profits. Well, it's a nice dream, but where are you going to sell them? You've already saturated the market in your area. There isn't market for it. Not a realistic one. Why can't I sell it in Michigan? Because by the time you get the goods there, the steel, to Michigan, the transportation costs are cost prohibitive. You won't make money. At best, you'll break even. It won't be worth it. So that's prohibitive. But when the railroads go in, it's so much faster, so much more convenient, so much cheaper, that like every capitalist, every business owner, every corporation in the country is like recalculating, going, "Oh my God! Not only can I sell in Michigan and the Midwest, we're going to do that. So I'm going to, take out a loan or, tap into, the huge amount of, cash that we have from our profits for the last 10, 20 years, and we're going to build new factories." And I'm just talking about regions, New York to Pennsylvania to Michigan. But as I said, once the Transcontinental Railroad goes through, this is now it's now realistic to think about selling everywhere. And even by the end of the Gilded Age, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil kind of being the leader here, but corporations are already starting to think internationally as well. And that started to become realistic, partially because of transportation improvements, technology on the high seas. The last thing that's on the screen here, that railroads stimulated other industries, what that means is that, we'll see this with the auto industry in a later unit, the railroads were so there's so many of them, so much demand for railroad cars and locomotives, but railroads, trains, locomotives are made up of lots of different materials. So it would stand to reason that if the railroad industry is booming, and if there's lots of railroads and there's more and more of them all the time, that the steel industry would boom, the coal industry would boom, the timber industry would boom, and on and on and on and on. I said we'll see this with cars as well. What's a car? Well, it's steel, it's glass, it's oil, right? And it's, all kinds of other things. So if the car industry, automotive industry is booming, you'd expect those kind of derivative related industries to be booming as well. So the railroad was so central to the economy, and you can see it. It's sort of a symptom and a partial sort of explanation as to how this happened. So on to our creative destroyers, and creative destroyer number one, Jay Gould. He's not as well known today as Rockefeller, Carnegie, or Morgan, but he was right up there with them in terms of his success, the fortune that he carved out, which was gigantic, and his just sort of ability. And he terrified competitors because he tended to kind of work secretively and kind of swoop down out of nowhere, surprise people with methods, techniques, strategy, and tactics that wiped them out. H.W. Brands, who've quoted already in this unit or in other units on the Gilded Age, said when intensely interested in any matter, he devoted his whole concentration of thought upon that one thing. He loved the intricacies and perplexities of financial problems. So this guy kind of ate, slept, and drank finance and sort of wheeling and dealing in anything in the business world. Professor Rourke, our guy, says the secretive Gould operated in the stock market like a shark, looking for vulnerable railroads, buying enough stock to take control, and threatening to undercut his competitors unless they bought him out at a high profit. Gould soon realized that a corporate failure could still mean financial success. So what he really was a railroad speculator, a Gilded Age corporate raider. And in this sense, in this kind of a unique way for the time, it was a useful creative destroyer. So what is a speculator? We don't usually think of people speculating in railroads, but you can at least theoretically speculate in anything. A speculator, we think of real estate speculation, stock speculating. What that means is you're not buying, say, the stock to hold on to it for an extended time or forever. You're buying and selling, wheeling and dealing. You're buying low and selling high, and your intention isn't to hold on to it for very long, just long enough to to get the price to rise or wait for the price to rise and sell it off at a handsome profit. That's what Gould did with railroads. He'd buy a railroad with the intent to try to buy it at a low price and then wait for, and in his case, manipulate the markets in his favor, things that would be illegal today but weren't in those days, though they were frowned upon and seen as unethical. But he was not above doing them. But he'd find ways to drive the market price down for a railroad that he zeroed in on and wanted. And when the share price got low enough, sure enough, he'd start buying up all the shares. And then he found ways to manipulate the price back up, and then sold the thing off, 6 months later, 2 years later, etc., for a handsome profit. Sometimes he sought to his advantage not to sell off the company that he purchased, the railroad that he purchased, not to sell it wholesale or in one piece whole, but to break it into pieces and sell different parts of it. So sell the rolling stock to one company, sell the stations to another company, sell the locomotives to another company, and make more profit that way sometimes. So when he did that, that means he totally gutted the railroad company, which would, I mean, he's obliterating it. So everybody that worked for that company would lose a job. So these guys could be and often were ruthless in their business practices. Ruthless. They weren't always ruthless or mean-spirited people in personal life, but they certainly could be and often were in this kind of competition. And I'm not defending them per se. It's hard to defend that kind of that level of greed. But keep in mind, this is a very competitive playing field. And part of the way Gould and others are probably thinking about this is, if I don't do that stuff, somebody else will, my competitors will, and I'll lose. I'll be driven out of business. So there's this kind of pressure as part of this system, which is one of the worst features, I think, of Gilded Age capitalism, maybe the worst feature of it. That's not to say that they're all capitalism, industrial capitalism, the Gilded Age is a net negative. I think there's lots of positives too. The positives may outweigh the negatives. That's a matter of interpretation, but nonetheless, there's certainly quite a bit of ugly downside to what Gould and many others like him are doing. He became so notorious for sort of preying upon these companies like a shark that whenever a company started to notice its share price going down, they start work. Is Gould out there somewhere? Is this him? And sometimes it would be, sometimes it wouldn't be. The share price was going down, their stock was going down for different reasons. But that's how much fear this guy inspired. Anytime the market price started to go down for a railroad, sometimes other businesses, companies as well, everyone's terrified that it's Gould waiting to pounce. So this guy then, by the way, his goal most of the time was to buy railroads and sell them as quickly as possible for a profit. But he did hold on to some of them for quite some time, mainly because he wasn't getting the deal he wanted yet. He hadn't gotten the price up high enough yet to do so. But he actually ended up being a good railroad operator. So his goal wasn't to sort of run these things forever and to become kind of a railroad owner / manager, but nonetheless he got caught sort of holding a number of these, and he managed them and controlled them effectively. So he actually was good at it when he put his mind to actually being productive with regard to building railroads, or at least keeping them intact instead of just gutting them and or selling them off. But his way of doing things, there's no doubt, however nasty it was, that it did force other railroad companies to not be complacent and to start thinking about ways in which they can become more competitive in the field. So this is sort of creative destruction at its finest. They're trying to kind of destroy each other, but there's creativity that goes into that because it's sometimes new ideas that gives you an upper hand over the competitors. Which brings us to creative destroyer number 2, Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, a rags to riches story, maybe the most famous one of the Gilded Age, and a true rags to riches story. He was a Scottish immigrant whose family moved to the United States from Scotland. Their Scottish modest home is in the upper right. A palace that he bought in Scotland later on when he became super rich and powerful in the bottom right. So this guy made good in the U.S. But he came, his parents didn't give him a choice. Maybe he was happy to go. I don't know that part of it. But I think he was like 12 years old when he got to the United States. and he's one of the most successful business people in U.S. history, and a household name even today. Lots of stuff named after him. Carnegie Hall. You've got a lot of money, you get things named after you because you're a benefactor and donate money to charitable causes. He was a known philanthropist, as we'll see. But he's one of those people that at a young age, people could sort of see that this guy appeared to be bound for success and just sort of had the right attitude, the right approach to things, seemed to always sort of know what he was doing, kind of always landing kind of on his feet. He started working for a railroad and learned how to do just as kind of a basic job as a young man. But he taught himself telegraphy, the mode of communication in those days before the telephone. Just before the telephone was the telegraph. Right? You had to learn Morse code and how to tap out the messages and write down the messages as they come in from outside. And at the railroad he worked for, there were telegraphers there that were full-time. That was their full-time job, and he learned it on his own. And the boss, guy was wealthy and powerful in his own right at the time when Carnegie was on his way up, kind of took Carnegie under his wing when he saw how talented this kid was. In fact, somewhat mockingly, somewhat jokingly, the boss' name was Tom Scott. They started calling Carnegie, behind his back usually, Tom's Andy. Right? So Tom's got an Andy, and he's got an Andrew Carnegie. But one day, the telegraphers weren't there, called in sick or whatever, and the boss was kind of frantic, and he didn't even know Carnegie had taught himself to do it. Carnegie said, I can take over. I was like, what? I can do this, no problem. And he just sat down and just handled the, it was a busy day, something important was going on, and he just sort of handled the messages going in and out, through Morse code and telegraphy, like it was nothing. Stayed calm and cool and collected. So it was noticed by everyone that knew him that this guy appeared to be, destined to move up, and indeed he did. As one scholar has said, Carnegie's genius was his talent for organization, and I think we underestimate talent for organization. You could say genius for organization. Or his genius was his talent. But I do think there are people that are organizational geniuses, and he appears to be one of them. The reason I think it's misleading, or we can kind of misunderstand that, is we tend to think of organization as being kind of like neat and tidy. So if you've got all your shoes lined up nicely in the closet and all your clothes in perfect order, that's a genius organization. No, it's not. That's being well organized. But a genius for organization means, in a sense, creatively organizing, finding ways to organize information and data and things that are hard to organize, maybe because there's just so much to organize or so many different categories. It's hard to make sense out of how do we simplify this? Take something incredibly complex and simplify it into an organizational system that makes it workable. It takes genius to do that. I'll give you a couple examples of it. In science, the classification for plants and animals that we still use, the Carl Linnaeus system, right, which sort of boils everything down to two names, two words, Homo sapiens, right? And yet that's not perfect, but it's incredible because the animal kingdom is, so diverse. This system took the animal kingdom and simplified it in a way that now we can name species and kind of know what we're talking about and kind of where they fit in the whole kind of tree and the different levels of this classification system. That is organizational genius. The same thing with the periodic table of elements. Right? Simply put together, but it tells us an awful lot that otherwise would be much more obscure and harder to get to or harder to remember without that table. So Carnegie wasn't doing science, but it's that kind of talent for organization that we're talking about here. So it's much more impressive to say that someone was an organizational genius than it at first sounds. The same scholar said Carnegie never wanted to know the profits. He always wanted to know the cost. This is true also of John D. Rockefeller, who's coming next. But another way to look at this or say this would be that the smart business people, still true to this day, realize that it's as important to pay attention to the production end of the process as it is the sort of marketing and sales end of the process. We tend to think of corporations today, whose products we buy, whose advertisements we see, whose cars we see driving around, as making money by selling either a high or low price, and that's how they make the profit. Well, that's partly how they do it, but the other end is just as important, maybe more important, and this is what a guy like Carnegie and a guy like Rockefeller and others saw, and that is that if Carnegie can find ways to reduce the costs of his steel production process. It's the steel industry he went into, by the way. He started on the railroads, but he started investing in steel, and then decided that's the career for me, and bought a steel mill, and then started to become legendary as he bought more and more and became the biggest steel producer in the country. But Carnegie could look at the production process, look at labor, look at overhead, and so we need to cut back costs, right? I want to know how much it cost us. How much did we waste this last month? How many materials did we waste in the production process? Because that's profit. The more you have to spend in producing the profit and overhead, labor costs on the assembly line, the machines, the more time it takes, the more money the less money you're going to have, out of the profits. So, for instance, hypothetically, if Carnegie's company, 2 years running, produced the exact same amount of steel of the exact same types, sold for the exact same price or prices for different types of steel, but between that first and second year, he had and his colleagues had figured out a way to cut their production costs by 1/2. What has he just done? He's doubled his profits, even though nothing had changed at the other end. This is the power of sort of being able to look at the production end of things and seeing that is maybe even a better way to make money. Right? We cut our costs at this end, and not only that, there's a second piece of this which maybe is even more important. There are lots of ways in a capitalist system and business to make money, through sales. So you can sell your product at a high price, but if you do that, you have to be able to sell a high quality product, or at least convince everyone, through advertising you're selling a quality product. Because why would they pay higher prices for something they get for cheaper if the quality isn't higher or is lower? So, and there's all kinds of gimmicks, buy one, get one free. But I think the best way to understand how an industrial capitalist system actually works in terms of kind of the competitive, flow, the creative destroyer kind of thing we're talking about, creative destruction thing we're talking about, is to sort of think of, and this is true, I think, most of the time, that most business competition between firms, between companies, is about underselling your opponent, selling for less, pricing your products cheaper, which sounds counterintuitive at first. Because, how do you make money by charging less? Don't you make money by charging more? Well, no, not if by charging less than all your other competitors, you get all their customers because they flock to you because they want to save money. Assuming, right, all things being even or equal, and they're not always, but all things being equal, everyone will want to buy your product. So the goal really is to not just save money by cutting costs, but to be able to lower your prices by cutting costs. In a way that your competitors can't. If you find a way to cut your production costs in half, it's usually not that dramatic, and your competitors can't do it, you're going to run them out of business because they can't afford to lower their prices like that much. We can't do this. If we lower our prices that much, our profits are less than our production costs. Lowering, reducing costs and lowering prices is sort of the way, the most kind of tried and true method of success, dominance, making a fortune as an individual, as a company. That really still stands to this day too. I'm simplifying because there are other elements to it as well, but I still think that's sort of the cardinal principle of capitalist competition, at least between businesses, corporations. So Carnegie Steel became the dominant force in the industry. He owned a number of mills. The Homestead Steel Mill, the most famous one today, you see in the picture in the bottom right. I like that picture just because it gives us a sense of the size, scale of these operations. That's not just one factory or one building. That's an entire city practically. The steel capital of the country, of course, was Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh Steelers. Right? They're named that for a reason. People laugh when I say that, but of course it's true. Pittsburgh is the steel town. Even the emblem on the Steelers' helmets is a reference to steel, chemical properties in steel. So Pittsburgh, just outside of Pittsburgh, is where Carnegie's works and many of the other steel companies' works were as well. Not all, but many. The importance of steel in a modern economy, I guess we don't have to deal with this too much, but let's fast forward a little bit just beyond the Gilded Age, because we start to see steel-hulled ships being built. And that gives us one clue as to the importance of steel. We already know, which is not just in shipbuilding itself, but in military shipbuilding, navies, battleships, and eventually aircraft carriers and this kind of thing. We've already seen another major application for steel, showing yet another way in which this became an incredibly important industry, and that's structural steel to build all the skyscrapers that are going vertical in city after city after city. So steel became one of the central industries in the Industrial Revolution. So Carnegie was in a central place. Our textbook talks about him as a pioneer, not the inventor or the only person engaged in it, but a pioneer in what's called vertical integration or vertical monopoly. And there's also horizontal monopoly, which we'll get to. But our textbook uses Carnegie as an example of vertical monopoly or integration, and it uses Rockefeller, we're getting to next, as an example and a pioneer that he was in horizontal monopoly. Truth is, both guys were doing both. But since our textbook uses one as an example of one and the other, I'll stick to that. So Carnegie practiced vertical integration. What does that mean? This is another way to try to control costs, cut costs, and that is to try to control all the stages of the process of your product. So steel mills that he owned at first meant he was sort of smelting, right, shaping the steel into whatever, iron rails for steel rails for railroads, etc. But if you're working for vertical monopoly, you start to you start to try to buy mines, iron ore mines. So instead of paying another company for the iron ore that get out of the ground, your company, or you buy a company that's your own company that mines for your steel company. You buy railroads. You at the other end, you maybe even get into marketing and distributing, transporting the goods as well. So it's trying to control sort of every part of the process of your product, your industry. And lower the prices accordingly, of course, because you're in control of it. He didn't do this perfectly. Nobody ever did 100%. And the best example of one of the stages that he took over in this way, in his attempt to achieve vertical monopoly, brings us face to face with his most important colleague, Henry Clay Frick, another major player in Gilded Age business, one of the big tycoons of the era himself. And in a sense, he worked for Andrew Carnegie, and yet was still fabulously wealthy by working for the company. Frick was the leading manufacturer or producer of what's called Coke. I don't mean cocaine or Coca-Cola. Coke was a derivative of coal that I don't know how it was treated chemically, but it was the preferred method of heating steel in steel mills. So Coke ovens, right? A company that had hundreds or thousands of Coke ovens would produce the Coke and then sell it to steel companies. And this is the type of thing that Carnegie zeroed in on and said, I don't want to buy, Coke to heat my steel. I want to do it myself. And he knew that Henry Clay Frick was the biggest Coke producer in Pennsylvania nearby, and so he went through the process of basically buying the majority of shares in Frick's own company, and then taking him on as an associate at the same time. So they became business partners, sort of, and they became kind of employer and employee, sort of, because Carnegie was clearly the more major player between the two. So it was never entirely clear whether they were equals or whether Frick worked for Carnegie, and I think caused problems for them and for others around them as well. Frick was very much known for his ruthlessness in business during the Homestead Steel Strike and after, which he was the one who led the opposition to the strike against the Homestead Steel Company, Carnegie's company, and a steel mill. But Carnegie was left on vacation, knowing that strike was going to happen while he was gone. He left Frick to deal with all of the pressure. Frick got shot in the process, even. But he said afterwards in a letter, we had to teach our employees a lesson, and we've taught them one they will never forget. They crushed that strike, as we'll see in our next unit after this one, in ruthless, brutal fashion. And he's saying that, basically bragging that they crushed it, so violently, actually. But the two, Carnegie and Frick, that is, had a falling out with each other. Probably partly because of the Homestead strike. I think both of them pointed fingers at each other afterwards when the press and the public, workers all over the country, were irate at the company's handling of their workers in such a sort of roughshod fashion, running roughshod over them. And there were some other reasons as well. When Frick desired to get out of the company, Carnegie tried to claim that he owed him less money than he actually did. There actually was a settlement in court that Frick won. So there were lots of reasons, and maybe some that I'm forgetting or don't even know, that for bad blood between the two of them. And there's sort of a somewhat funny story now, that when they were both retired, older men, both living in Manhattan, rich guys, retired, living in mansions, but somewhat away from each other, Andrew Carnegie, as people in their senior years sometimes want to do, they want to tie up loose ends. They don't want to leave, conflicts necessarily still kind of open. They want to kind of bring things to kind of some closure. So we can say, Carnegie was the bigger man in this sense, because he wanted to make amends with Henry Clay Frick before they, one of them and both of them died. So both of them were, somewhat ill, and so he sent a servant. These guys had lots of servants. He sent a servant across town with a note to Frick's mansion. And another servant on Frick's side opened the door and said, okay, I'll take this note to my boss. Goes down the hall and disappears. And you can tell Frick was passionate about this issue, because if he didn't want to, the note said something to the effect, we should meet sometime and talk and chat over dinner or whatever it was. That's what the note said. But if Frick wasn't interested. He could have just told the servant, tell the guy to go away, crumple up his note or hand it back to him and said, we're not, not interested. Tell your boss that. But he actually came out himself, walked down the hall to the front door, and told the messenger, this guy's just a messenger, and said the words you see at the bottom of the screen, tell Mr. Carnegie I will meet him. I will meet him in hell, and like slam the door. So Frick wanted no part of reconciliation with Andrew Carnegie, and it's possible that Carnegie had done more harm to Frick than otherwise, so that Frick was, understandably not responding. But it's also partially, again, possible that Carnegie was just sort of the bigger man here. This guy held the grudge, maybe too long.